When historians at the Smithsonian discovered what appeared to be real human teeth embedded in the cracked porcelain face of a doll from 1902, they immediately sealed the photograph and contacted the FBI. The 7-year-old girl holding that doll had died mysteriously just weeks after the photo was taken, and the doll had vanished from her belongings before her burial. What they found next would challenge everything they thought they knew about Victorian mourning practices and send chills down the spine of even the most seasoned investigators. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The sepia-toned photograph arrived at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., on a cold February morning in 2023. Part of a larger estate donation from the recently deceased Clara Whitmore, a 94-year-old collector of Victorian memorabilia. Dr. Helena Vasquez, the museum's chief curator of photographic archives, had seen thousands of period photographs throughout her 20-year career. But something about this particular image made her pause as she lifted it from the acid-free storage box with her white cotton gloves. The photograph showed a young girl, seated in what appeared to be a professional studio setting, complete with the ornate carved chair and painted backdrop typical of early 1900s portrait photography. The child wore a pale cotton dress with intricate lacework at the collar and cuffs, her dark hair pulled back with a white ribbon that caught the studio lights. In her arms, she clutched a porcelain doll dressed in miniature finery that mirrored her own outfit. At first glance, it seemed like countless other formal portraits from that era, the kind of stiff, serious photographs that Victorian families treasured as precious keepsakes. But something about the girl's expression troubled Helena. While most children in photographs from that period appeared solemn due to the long exposure times required by early cameras, this girl's face held a different quality entirely. Her eyes seemed to hold a weight far beyond her apparent 7 or 8 years, and her grip on the doll appeared almost desperate, as if she feared someone might snatch it away at any moment. The doll itself was exquisite, with delicate painted features and what appeared to be real human hair, arranged in perfect ringlets. But there was something unsettling about its face that Helena couldn't quite identify. She placed the photograph under her high-powered magnifying lamp and adjusted the angle to reduce glare from the glass frame. As she leaned closer to examine the fine details of the image, her breath caught in her throat. The doll's mouth, which she had initially assumed was painted in the typical rosebud style of the era, appeared to contain what looked distinctly like teeth. Not the smooth, painted suggestion of teeth that doll makers typically created, but actual individual teeth, with realistic variations in size and subtle discoloration that spoke of genuine dental enamel. Helena removed her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes, certain that the long hours of cataloging were playing tricks on her vision. But when she looked again through the magnifying lens, the teeth were still there, small and white and undeniably real-looking. She called over her assistant, Marcus Chen, a graduate student in art history who had been helping with the Victorian collection. "Marcus, come take a look at this," she said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that was unusual for the typically confident curator. "Tell me what you see in the doll's mouth." Marcus adjusted the lamp and peered through the magnifying glass, his young face creasing in concentration. After a moment, he looked up at Helena with confusion written across his features. "Those look like actual teeth," he said slowly. "But that's impossible, right? I mean, who would put real teeth in a doll?" Helena had been wondering the same thing. Victorian doll makers were known for their attention to realistic details, using real hair, glass eyes, and carefully painted features to create dolls that were as lifelike as possible. But embedding actual human teeth in a porcelain face would have been both technically challenging and deeply disturbing, even by the sometimes macabre standards of Victorian mourning culture. She photographed the image with her high-resolution digital camera, capturing multiple angles and lighting conditions to ensure that what they were seeing wasn't simply an optical illusion created by the age and condition of the original photograph. When she uploaded the images to her computer and enhanced them using the museum's advanced imaging software, the teeth became even more pronounced and clearly defined. The discovery prompted Helena to research the provenance of the photograph more thoroughly. The accompanying documentation indicated that it had been part of Clara Whitmore's collection for over 30 years, purchased from an estate sale in Salem, Massachusetts in 1992. The original owner had been identified as the Fletcher family, and according to the sparse records, the photograph had been taken at Morrison's portrait studio in Boston sometime in 1902. Helena spent the next several days diving deep into genealogical records, newspaper archives, and historical documents, trying to piece together the story behind the mysterious photograph. What she discovered was both tragic and deeply unsettling. The girl in the photograph was Marian Fletcher, born on March 15, 1895, to Jonathan and Elizabeth Fletcher of Beacon Hill. The family had been moderately wealthy, with Jonathan working as a successful textile merchant who had made his fortune importing fine fabrics from Europe. Marian had been their only child, born after several miscarriages that had left Elizabeth in a state of constant anxiety about her daughter's health and well-being. According to family letters that had been donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, Elizabeth had been extraordinarily protective of Marian, rarely allowing her to play with other children, and keeping her confined to their elegant brownstone home for most of her short life. The portrait had been taken in early November of 1902, just 6 weeks before Marian's death. According to the death certificate that Helena obtained from the Boston City Archives, Marian had died on December 23, 1902, from what was listed as scarlet fever. The attending physician, Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, had noted that the child's condition had deteriorated rapidly over the course of just 3 days, progressing from a mild throat irritation to complete organ failure with unusual speed. But it was what Helena discovered about the aftermath of Marian's death that truly chilled her to the bone. According to a brief newspaper article published in the Boston Herald on December 26, 1902, there had been some controversy surrounding Marian's burial. The article, buried on page 7 between advertisements for patent medicines and holiday sales, reported that several of the child's most prized possessions had mysteriously disappeared from the Fletcher household between her death and the funeral service. The most significant missing item was described as an exquisite porcelain doll of French manufacture, said to be the child's most beloved companion. The article noted that Elizabeth Fletcher had been inconsolable, not only due to her daughter's death, but also because of the doll's disappearance, claiming that Marian would not rest peacefully without her cherished toy. Jonathan Fletcher had offered a reward of $50, a substantial sum at the time, for the doll's return, but it was never found. Helena discovered additional details in a private diary kept by the family's housekeeper, Margaret O'Brien, which had been preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society's collection. Margaret's entries from late December 1902 painted a picture of a household consumed by grief and strange occurrences. She wrote of hearing what sounded like a child's laughter coming from Marian's sealed bedroom in the days following the funeral, and of finding small muddy footprints in the hallway leading to the front door, as if someone had entered the house from outside during the night. Most disturbing was Margaret's entry from December 30, 1902, in which she wrote, "Found Mrs. Fletcher in the parlor this morning, talking to empty air as if Miss Marian were sitting there beside her. When I asked if she was well, she pointed to the velvet chair and said, 'Can't you see her? She's come back for her dolly.' I looked, but saw nothing save shadows and dust motes dancing in the winter light." As Helena delved deeper into the historical records, she began to uncover a pattern of similar incidents connected to Morrison's portrait studio. Between 1900 and 1905, the studio had photographed at least 12 children who died within weeks or months of their portraits being taken. In each case, the children had been photographed with beloved toys or possessions that later went missing from their homes after their deaths. The studio's proprietor, Augustus Morrison, had been something of an enigma in Boston's photography circles. Unlike his contemporaries, who focused primarily on formal family portraits and wedding photographs, Morrison seemed to specialize in photographs of children, particularly those who appeared to be in poor health. His advertisements in local newspapers promised portraits that capture the eternal essence of childhood and images that preserve the soul beyond mortal bounds. Helena found Augustus Morrison's own obituary in the Boston Globe archives, dated March 14, 1906. The cause of death was listed as a sudden heart attack, but the circumstances surrounding his death were unusual. According to the article, Morrison had been found dead in his studio, surrounded by hundreds of photographs of children, many of whom had died shortly after their portraits were taken. The photographs had been arranged in what witnesses described as a ritualistic pattern around his body, and several neighbors reported seeing strange lights emanating from the studio windows in the hours before his body was discovered. The most chilling detail came from Morrison's assistant, a young man named David Hartwell, who told police that his employer had been working on something he called preservation photography in the months before his death. According to Hartwell's statement, Morrison believed that he could capture and preserve the life essence of his subjects through a special photographic process that involved embedding personal items from the children into their portraits in some inexplicable way. Helema's research revealed that Morrison had studied in Paris in the 1880s, where he had apparently become fascinated with the emerging field of spirit photography and the occult practices that surrounded it. Several of his colleagues from that time described him as brilliant, but increasingly obsessed with the concept of death and preservation, often speaking of finding ways to keep the souls of the dead tethered to the physical world through photographic means. As the weeks passed and Helena continued her investigation, she began to experience strange occurrences in her own life. She would often wake in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that someone was watching her, and on several occasions, she found her research materials rearranged in her office despite the museum's strict security protocols. Most unsettling was the day she arrived at work to find a small bouquet of wilted white roses on her desk, arranged around a handwritten note that simply read, "She wants her dolly back." The security cameras showed no evidence of anyone entering Helena's office after hours, and the museum's night guard, Robert Walsh, insisted that he had made his regular rounds and found nothing unusual. The handwriting on the note appeared to be that of a child, with the uneven letters and careful penmanship typical of someone just learning to write. Helena had the note analyzed by a handwriting expert who confirmed that it had been written with a fountain pen using ink consistent with early 1900s manufacturing, despite the paper appearing to be modern. Marcus, her assistant, began to notice changes in Helena's behavior as well. She became increasingly obsessed with the Marian Fletcher photograph, spending hours each day studying it under various types of lighting and magnification. She started arriving at the museum early and staying late, often forgetting to eat meals or return phone calls. When Marcus expressed concern about her well-being, Helena would simply shake her head and mutter about needing to solve the puzzle before it's too late. The breakthrough came when Helena decided to have the photograph examined using the museum's new multispectral imaging system, a cutting-edge technology that could reveal hidden layers and details invisible to the CPA naked eye. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. Under ultraviolet light, additional writing became visible in the background of the photograph, scratched into the studio's painted backdrop in what appeared to be a child's handwriting. The message, barely visible even under UV enhancement, read, "The dolly took my teeth so I could stay. She promised we would play forever. But I want to go home now. Please help me find the way." Helena immediately contacted Dr. James Morrison, a forensic anthropologist at Harvard University who specialized in historical investigations. Despite sharing a surname with the photographer, James assured her that he was not related to Augustus Morrison, though he had heard whispers about the photographer's unusual practices through his academic connections with Boston's historical community. Dr. Morrison agreed to examine the photograph using even more advanced imaging techniques available at Harvard's laboratory. The results confirmed Helena's worst suspicions. Not only were the teeth in the doll's mouth unmistakably real, but spectral analysis revealed that they contained traces of calcium phosphate and other minerals consistent with human dental enamel from the early 1900s. Even more disturbing, the isotopic composition of the teeth suggested they had come from a child approximately 7 years old. "I've seen some strange things in my career," Dr. Morrison told Helena as they reviewed the lab results in his cluttered office overlooking Harvard Yard. "But this is unlike anything I've encountered. Somehow, actual human teeth were embedded in this doll's porcelain face, and based on the photographic evidence, they were already there when the portrait was taken in 1902. Helena asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. Could they be Marian Fletcher's teeth? Dr. Morrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and studied the enhanced images spread across his desk. "It's possible," he said slowly. "But if so, it raises disturbing questions about what Augustus Morrison was really doing in that studio. Was he somehow extracting teeth from his child subjects and incorporating them into their toys? And if so, why?" The investigation took a darker turn when Helena discovered Morrison's personal journals, which had been stored in the basement of the Boston Public Library since his death. The journals, written in Morrison's cramped handwriting, revealed a man increasingly consumed by grief and obsession following the death of his own daughter, Lily, in 1898. Lily Morrison had died at the age of 6 from diphtheria, and her death had shattered her father's previously rational worldview. In the months following her funeral, Morrison had become convinced that he could find a way to bring her back, or at least preserve some essence of her spirit in the physical world. He had begun experimenting with what he called sympathetic photography, believing that by incorporating physical elements from his subjects into their portraits, he could create a bridge between the living and the dead. The journal entries from 1900 through 1905 documented Morrison's descent into increasingly desperate and unethical practices. He wrote of convincing grieving parents to allow him to take keepsakes from their dying children, claiming that these items would help preserve their memory in the photographs. In reality, he was collecting teeth, hair, and even small amounts of blood, which he somehow incorporated into the dolls and toys that his subjects held during their portrait sessions. Morrison's final journal entry, dated March 13, 1906, just one day before his death, revealed the full extent of his madness. "Lily comes to me each night now, along with the others. They gather around my bed, these beautiful children, all holding their special dolls and toys. They whisper secrets of the space between life and death, and they promise that soon I will join them in their eternal playground. The preservation is nearly complete. Soon, no child will ever truly die again." Helena shared Morrison's journals with Dr. Morrison and a small team of historians and forensic experts, swearing them to secrecy until they could fully understand the implications of their discovery. The consensus was that Augustus Morrison had somehow been drugging or sedating his child subjects during their portrait sessions, extracting their teeth, and then embedding them in specially prepared dolls using techniques that remained unclear even with modern analysis. The question remained, what had happened to these dolls after the children died? The historical record showed that in every case, the dolls had disappeared from the family's homes, often within days of the children's deaths. Some families reported seeing their deceased children playing with the dolls in their bedrooms or gardens, while others claimed the dolls had been taken by mysterious strangers who came in the night. Helena's investigation was interrupted by a phone call from Clara Whitmore's estate attorney, informing her that additional items from the collector's estate had been discovered in a hidden room in her Massachusetts home. Among these items were 17 more photographs from Morrison's studio, each showing a different child with a doll or toy, and all dating from the same period between 1900 and 1905. When Helena traveled to Salem to examine these photographs, she made a discovery that left her physically ill. In the hidden room, carefully arranged on antique shelves, were 17 porcelain dolls that perfectly matched the ones in the photographs. Each doll's mouth contained what appeared to be real human teeth, and several showed signs of recent handling despite having supposedly been sealed away for over a century. The dolls were accompanied by handwritten labels in Clara Whitmore's careful script, identifying each one with a child's name and date of death. At the center of the collection was a doll that matched the one from Marian Fletcher's photograph, labeled simply, "Marian, December 23, 1902, still waiting to go home." Helena noticed that this particular doll appeared different from the others. While the other 17 dolls looked exactly as they had in the century-old photographs, Marian's doll showed signs of age and wear that suggested regular handling. Its clothing was slightly faded, its porcelain face bore new hairline cracks, and most unnervingly, its eyes seemed to follow Helena as she moved around the room. Clara Whitmore's personal papers, also discovered in the hidden room, revealed that she had been in contact with something she referred to as the children for over 60 years. Her diary entries, dating back to the 1960s, described regular visits from child spirits who came to play with their dolls in the night. Clara had apparently served as a caretaker for these supernatural children, maintaining their dolls and providing a safe space where they could continue to exist in some form. Clara's final diary entry, written just days before her death, was particularly chilling. "They're ready to move on now, all except little Marian. She's been waiting the longest and her grief runs deepest. She says her mama never stopped crying, and she can't bear to leave her behind. But the weight of staying is breaking her spirit into pieces. Someone needs to help her understand that love sometimes means letting go." End quote. Helena realized that Clara Whitmore had spent decades serving as a guardian for these trapped child spirits, and now that Clara was gone, the responsibility had somehow fallen to her. The strange occurrences in her office, the handwritten note, the feeling of being watched, all these things suddenly made terrible sense. Marian Fletcher had been trying to communicate with her, seeking help to finally find peace after more than a century of supernatural limbo. Working with Dr. Morrison and a small team of paranormal researchers from nearby universities, Helena developed a plan to help Marian and the other child spirits find their way to whatever came next. The process required returning each doll to its original family's burial site and performing a ritual designed to sever the supernatural connection between the children's spirits and their physical anchors. The first 16 dolls were relatively easy to place. Helena and her team traveled to cemeteries throughout Massachusetts, locating the graves of the children from Morrison's photographs and carefully burying each doll with its corresponding child. In each case, witnesses reported seeing a faint light emanating from the grave as the doll was interred, followed by what sounded like a child's sigh of relief carried on the wind. But Marian Fletcher's case proved more complicated. When Helena arrived at Mount Auburn Cemetery to locate Marian's grave, she discovered that the child's body was not there. According to cemetery records, Jonathan and Elizabeth Fletcher had moved their daughter's remains to a family mausoleum in rural Vermont shortly after her death, believing that a more secluded location would provide better protection from grave robbers and curiosity seekers. The journey to Vermont required Helena to travel through a severe winter storm that seemed to intensify as she drew closer to the mausoleum's location. Her rental car struggled through increasingly deep snowdrifts, and on several occasions, she was certain she heard a child's voice calling her name over the howling wind. When she finally reached the small cemetery where the Fletcher family mausoleum stood, she found that the iron gates had been mysteriously unlocked despite the facility's policy of keeping them secure during winter months. The mausoleum itself was a modest stone structure, weathered by more than a century of New England winters, but still solid and dignified. Helena used her flashlight to locate the Fletcher family crypt, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she searched among the stone tablets for Marianne's name. When she found it, she was surprised to see that someone had recently placed a small bouquet of white roses on the marker, despite the remote location and harsh weather conditions. As Helena prepared to inter the doll beside Marianne's grave marker, she became aware of a presence in the mausoleum with her. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and her flashlight beam began to flicker erratically. In the wavering light, she could just make out the outline of a small figure standing near the far wall of the crypt. "Marianne?" Helena whispered, her voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Is that you, sweetheart?" The figure moved closer, resolving into the shape of a young girl in a pale dress, her dark hair still adorned with a white ribbon. She looked exactly as she had in the photograph, but her eyes held a sadness that seemed to encompass more than a century of longing and pain. "I've been waiting such a long time," Marianne said, her voice carrying the hollow quality of wind through empty spaces. "Mama cried every day after I left. I could hear her calling for me, so I couldn't go. But staying hurts so much, and I'm so tired now." Helena knelt down to Marianne's eye level, still clutching the porcelain doll that had somehow bound the child's spirit to the earthly realm for over 100 years. "Your mama isn't crying anymore, Marianne. She's been waiting for you somewhere much better than this cold place. She wants you to be happy and free." "But what about my dolly?" Marianne asked, looking at the porcelain figure in Helena's hands. "She has my teeth, so part of me is still inside her. If I leave her behind, will I be whole again?" Helena understood now that Morrison's horrific experiments had created a supernatural connection between the children and their dolls that went far beyond simple possession. By embedding their teeth into the porcelain faces, he had literally anchored portions of their souls to these objects, preventing them from moving on to whatever awaited them after death. "When we put your dolly to rest with you," Helena explained gently, "that part of your soul will be returned to you, and you'll be complete again. Then you can go find your mama and daddy, and you'll never have to be lonely or cry." "Scared again?" Marian nodded solemnly, her small form beginning to shimmer and fade, as if she were made of morning mist. "Will you tell them I wasn't afraid at the end? Will you tell them I love them, and I'm sorry I made them sad?" Helena placed the doll carefully beside Marian's grave marker and spoke a simple prayer for the child's peace and reunion with her family. As she finished, the mausoleum filled with a warm, golden light that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. In that light, Helena saw Marian's form become solid and vibrant once more, the sadness leaving her eyes as she was embraced by two adult figures who had been waiting patiently for their daughter's return. The last thing Helena heard before the light faded was the sound of a child's joyful laughter, finally free from the weight of a century's worth of grief and supernatural imprisonment. When her vision cleared, the mausoleum was empty except for the porcelain doll, which had cracked cleanly in half, releasing the small teeth that had bound Marian's spirit for so long. Helena carefully collected the teeth and buried them in the frozen ground beside the mausoleum, saying a final prayer for Marian Fletcher and all the other children who had been victims of Augustus Morrison's twisted beret experiments. As she walked back to her car through the still falling snow, she felt a sense of peace and completion that she had never experienced before. The investigation officially concluded with Helena's report to the Smithsonian, though the full details were classified and shared only with a select group of researchers and law enforcement officials. The 17 dolls and their corresponding photographs were placed in a secure storage facility, where they would remain as evidence of one of the most disturbing cases of supernatural exploitation in American Bernal history. Helena returned to her normal duties as chief curator, but she was forever changed by her encounter with Marian Fletcher and the revelation of Augustus Morrison's crimes. She established a small, discreet research division within the museum dedicated to investigating similar cases of supernatural artifacts and historical mysteries, ensuring that other trapped souls might find their way to peace. In the months following Marianne's release, Helena received several letters from families around New England who had discovered similar dolls in their attics and basements. Dolls that seemed to move on their own and whispered the names of long-dead children in the night. Each case was handled with the same care and respect that had been shown to Marian, and each resulted in another child spirit finding freedom after decades or centuries of supernatural bondage. The photograph of Marian Fletcher holding her doll was eventually displayed in a special exhibition on Victorian photography, though the full story behind it was never revealed to the public. Visitors often commented on the haunting quality of the image and the strange sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the little girl's face, never knowing that they were looking at the final evidence of a mystery that had taken more than a century to solve. Helena kept Clara Whitmore's diary as a reminder of the importance of compassion and dedication in the face of supernatural mysteries. The elderly collector's decades-long service as a guardian for trapped child spirits had been both a burden and a blessing, and Helena felt honored to have played a part in completing Clara's work. On quiet evenings in her office at the museum, Helena would sometimes feel the presence of grateful spirits passing through, no longer bound to the physical world but stopping to acknowledge her role in their liberation. These encounters filled her with a deep sense of purpose and reminded her that history was not just about preserving artifacts and documents, but about honoring the human experiences and emotions that gave those objects meaning. The case of Marian Fletcher and the 18 cursed dolls became legendary within the small community of paranormal researchers and supernatural investigators, though it was rarely discussed outside those circles. Helena published a carefully edited academic paper on the historical aspects of the case, focusing on Augustus Morrison's photography techniques and their place in Victorian mourning culture, but the supernatural beret elements remained classified. Years later, when Helena was approaching retirement, she received one final letter related to the case. It had been forwarded through several addresses and appeared to have been written by a child, though the postmark was illegible. The letter contained just a few lines in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. "Thank you for helping us find our way home. We are all together now, and we are happy. With love and gratitude, Marianne and friends." Attached to the letter was a small photograph that appeared to have been taken in the early 1900s, showing 18 children playing together in a sunlit meadow. At the center of the group was a young girl in a pale dress with a white ribbon in her dark hair, smiling with the carefree joy that had been absent from her original portrait. There were no dolls in sight, just children being children, free to play and laugh and run, without the weight of supernatural bondage holding them back. Helena framed the photograph and placed it on her desk next to Marian's original portrait, a reminder that even the darkest mysteries could have hopeful endings when approached with courage, compassion, and determination. The case had taught her that the past never truly stays buried, but it had also shown her that with patience and understanding, even the most tortured souls could find peace. As she prepared to pass her research division on to the next generation of investigators, Helena often reflected on how one mysterious photograph had led to the liberation of 18 child spirits who had been, quote, trapped for over a century. It reinforced her belief that every artifact in the museum's collection had a story to tell, and that some of those stories were far more important and complex than anyone could imagine. The legacy of Augustus Morrison served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of grief, unchecked by ethics, and the terrible consequences that could result when love became twisted into possession and control. His victims, however, had become symbols of resilience and hope, proof that even in death, the human spirit could endure and ultimately triumph over those who sought to exploit and imprison it. Helena's final report on the case concluded with a simple but profound observation. History is not just about the preservation of objects and documents, but about understanding and honoring the human experiences that give those artifacts meaning. When we approach the past with empathy and respect, we sometimes find that the past reaches back to us, seeking understanding, justice, and peace. Our responsibility as guardians of history extends beyond mere cataloging and display. It encompasses a sacred duty to help resolve the unfinished business of those who came before us. The photograph of Marian Fletcher continued to be displayed in the museum's Victorian photography collection, though visitors never suspected the true story behind the haunting image. To them, it remained simply a beautiful and melancholy reminder of childhood's fragility and the passage of time. But for Helena and her small team of supernatural investigators, it would always represent something much more significant, a testament to the power of persistence, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of love that connect all human souls across the boundaries of life and death. In the end, the mystery of the little girl holding a doll in 1902 had been solved not through advanced technology or academic research alone, but through the simple human act of listening to a child's plea for help and responding with kindness and determination. It was a lesson that Helena carried with her for the rest of her life, and one that she passed on to every researcher who joined her small but important division, dedicated to helping the dead find peace and the living understand the true depth and complexity of human experience across the burr. Centuries. But the story of Marian Fletcher and Augustus Morrison's cursed dolls would have one final, unexpected chapter that would unfold nearly 2 years after Helena thought the case had been permanently closed. It began with a phone call on a rainy Thursday morning in October 2025, just as Helena was reviewing applications for a new research assistant position within her Supernatural Artifacts division. The caller identified herself as Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a genealogist and historian from Edinburgh, Scotland, and she claimed to have information about Augustus Morrison that would fundamentally change Helena's understanding of the photographer's origins and motivations. Dr. Blackwood explained that she had been researching her own family history when she discovered that Augustus Morrison was actually her great-great-grandfather. Born Angus Mac Reynolds in a small Scottish village in 1858, before emigrating to America in 1879. "I've been trying to piece together why my family changed their name and moved so suddenly to Boston," Dr. Blackwood explained during their initial phone conversation, her Scottish accent adding gravity to every word. "My research led me to some very disturbing discoveries about what happened in our village before my ancestor fled to America," and I believe it may explain why he became so obsessed with preserving the dead. Helena's interest was immediately piqued. She had always wondered what had driven Morrison to develop his horrific techniques for supernatural preservation, and the idea that his obsession might have predated his own daughter's death opened up entirely new avenues of investigation. She arranged to meet Dr. Blackwood in Edinburgh the following month, using museum funds to justify the research trip as an extension of her ongoing Victorian photography project. The flight to Scotland gave Helena time to review all of her files on the Morrison case and to prepare questions about this new revelation. She had assumed that Morrison's descent into supernatural experimentation had been triggered by grief over his daughter Lily's death. But if Dr. Blackwood was correct, his interest in preserving the dead might have much deeper roots in family history and cultural tradition. Edinburgh in November was cold and gray, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into Helena's bones as she made her way from the airport to her hotel in the Old Town. The city's ancient architecture and narrow cobblestone streets created an atmosphere that felt perfectly suited to discussions of supernatural mysteries and family secrets that had been buried for over a century. Dr. Blackwood had arranged to meet Helena at the National Library of Scotland, where she had been conducting much of her genealogical research. Sarah Blackwood proved to be a woman in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair and intense green eyes that reminded Helena uncomfortably of the portraits she had seen of Augustus Morrison. She carried herself with the careful precision of someone accustomed to handling delicate historical documents, and her knowledge of Scottish clan history and folklore was immediately apparent. "My family has always known that there was something dark in our past," Dr. Blackwood began as they settled into a quiet corner of the library's research room, surrounded by towers of ancient books and genealogical charts. "My grandmother used to whisper stories about an ancestor who had been forced to flee Scotland because of his involvement with the old ways, but she would never provide specific details. It wasn't until I began serious genealogical research that I discovered the truth about Angus Mac Reynolds and what he had done in our village." Sarah spread out a collection of photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and handwritten family records that painted a disturbing picture of life in the remote Scottish Highlands during the mid-1800s. The village of Glenmorvich had been home to fewer than 200 people, most of whom survived through subsistence farming and sheep herding in the harsh mountain environment. But according to Sarah's research, the village had also been home to an ancient tradition of communicating with the dead that dated back to pre-Christian Celtic practices. The Mac Reynolds family had served as the village's death speakers for generations, Sarah explained, pointing to family records that traced the lineage back to the 1600s. They were responsible for helping the souls of the recently deceased communicate with their living relatives, providing comfort to grieving families and ensuring that the dead could pass on important information before moving on to whatever came next. End quote. Helena studied the documents with growing fascination and unease. The death-speaking tradition appeared to involve elaborate rituals that took place in the days immediately following a person's death, during which the death speaker would use various techniques to temporarily anchor the deceased spirit to the physical world long enough for final communications to take place. The process was supposed to be temporary and beneficial, providing closure for both the living and the dead. But according to Sarah's research, Angus Mac Reynolds had begun to experiment with ways to extend these communications indefinitely, believing that he could perfect the ancient techniques to allow permanent contact between the living and the dead. The village records, kept by the local church minister, documented a series of increasingly disturbing incidents beginning in 1876, when several families reported that their deceased relatives had been appearing to them nightly for weeks or months after their deaths, unable to find peace or move on to the afterlife. The minister's records described children who had died of fever or accident continuing to play in their family gardens weeks after their burials. Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite the library's empty research room. Parents reported that their dead children would appear at their bedsides each night, begging for food or comfort, but growing increasingly angry and desperate as time passed without their spiritual needs being met. The situation in Glenmorvich had deteriorated rapidly throughout 1877 and 1878, as more and more of the village's dead became trapped in a supernatural limbo between life and death. Families began to report that their homes were overrun with the spirits of deceased relatives who could not find rest, and several villagers died from exhaustion and terror after weeks of being haunted by increasingly hostile supernatural presences. Helena realized that Augustus Morrison's techniques for binding children's spirits to dolls represented a sophisticated evolution of the crude methods his ancestor had used in Scotland. While Angus Mac Reynolds had simply prevented the dead from moving on, Augustus had developed a way to anchor specific spirits to physical objects, creating a more controlled and targeted form of supernatural by imprisonment. "What happened to Angus Mac Reynolds?" Helena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer based on the pattern she had seen in Augustus Morrison's life. Sarah's expression grew even more somber as she pulled out the final set of documents from her research collection. The village turned against him in early 1879, when the Death Speaker was finally blamed for the supernatural crisis that was destroying their community. According to the church records, a mob of villagers stormed the Mac Reynolds cottage on February 14, 1879, intending to force Angus to reverse whatever he had done to trap their deceased relatives. The confrontation had ended in tragedy, with Angus Mac Reynolds' wife and infant son being killed in the violence that followed. Angus himself had barely escaped with his life, fleeing into the highland wilderness with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small collection of family artifacts that contained the accumulated knowledge of NRS. Generations of Death Speakers. The village records indicated that most of the trapped spirits had been released following Angus's departure, though several families reported continued supernatural activity for months afterward. He made his way to Glasgow and then boarded a ship to Boston, changing his name to Augustus Morrison during the voyage, Sarah concluded. "I believe he spent his first years in America trying to forget his past and live a normal life, but when his own daughter died, the grief reactivated his ancestral knowledge and drove him to perfect the techniques that had destroyed his Scottish village." End quote. Helena felt a chill of recognition as she realized the implications of Sarah's research. Augustus Morrison hadn't been a grief-stricken father who had stumbled into supernatural experimentation. He had been a trained practitioner of ancient death magic, whose family traditions had equipped him with the knowledge necessary to trap souls in the physical world. His use of children's teeth and dolls represented a refinement of techniques that had been passed down through generations of Scottish death speakers. "There's something else," Sarah said hesitantly, clearly struggling with whether to share her final revelation. "Something that I discovered just last week, after I had already contacted you about meeting here in Edinburgh. I'm not sure how to interpret it, but I think you need to know." Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate Celtic knotwork that seemed to shift and move in the library's fluorescent lighting. "This belonged to Angus Mac Reynolds, passed down through my family for over a century. My grandmother gave it to me before she died, with strict instructions never to open it unless the family's past came back to threaten the present." Helena stared at the box with growing apprehension, recognizing the same sense of supernatural presence that had surrounded Marian Fletcher's doll and the other cursed artifacts she had encountered. "What's inside it?" "I don't know for certain," Sarah admitted, "but based on my research into Death Speaker traditions, I believe it contains the tools and materials that Angus used for his rituals. My grandmother always claimed that the box called to her at night, whispering in voices that sounded like children who had died long ago. She said that as long as it remained closed, the voices stayed quiet, but she worried about what might happen if it were ever opened by someone who didn't understand its power." Helena's investigation had taught her to be extremely cautious around supernatural artifacts, especially those connected to the Morrison family's dark legacy. But she also recognized that the box might contain crucial information about how Augustus Morrison had developed his techniques for binding souls to physical objects, knowledge that could be vital for preventing similar cases in the future. "Would you be willing to let me study the box using some non-invasive techniques?" Helena asked carefully. "I have access to equipment that might allow us to examine its contents without actually opening it, at least initially." Sarah nodded slowly, clearly torn between her desire to understand her family's history and her fear of awakening something that had been deliberately kept dormant for generations. My grandmother always said that the knowledge in that box was too dangerous to use but too important to destroy. She believed that someday, someone would need to understand what my ancestor had done in order to undo the damage he had caused. Helena arranged to have the box shipped to the Smithsonian using the museum's specialized transport protocols for potentially supernatural artifacts. The process took several weeks, during which she prepared her laboratory and assembled a team of experts who could assist with the analysis while maintaining appropriate safety precautions. Dr. Morrison from Harvard agreed to participate in the investigation, along with Dr. Patricia Reeves, a specialist in Celtic folklore and ancient ritual practices from Georgetown University. The team also included Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who had studied exorcism and supernatural intervention techniques at the Vatican, and Dr. Lisa Chen, a physicist who specialized in analyzing unusual electromagnetic phenomena associated with allegedly haunted objects. When the box arrived at the Smithsonian in late December 2025, nearly 3 years after Helena's first encounter with Marian Fletcher's photograph, the team was ready to begin their analysis. The wooden container measured approximately 8 inches by 6 inches by 4 inches deep, and despite its apparent age, it showed no signs of decay or deterioration. The Celtic knotwork carved into its surface seemed to pulse with a faint inner light when viewed under certain lighting conditions, and several team members reported hearing distant whispers when they stood close to it for extended periods. Dr. Chen's electromagnetic analysis revealed that the box was generating a low-level energy field that fluctuated in patterns consistent with communication attempts. The frequencies matched those sometimes associated with electronic voice phenomena, the supposed ability of spirits to manipulate electronic devices to communicate with the living. More disturbing was her discovery that the energy field intensified whenever children were present in the laboratory, suggesting that whatever was inside the box was specifically attracted to young souls. Dr. Reeves's research into Celtic deaf speaker traditions provided context for the box's probable contents. According to ancient texts and folklore, deaf speakers typically used a collection of ritual tools that included carved bone implements, specially prepared stones or crystals, dried herbs associated with death and rebirth, and personal items taken from the deceased. The most powerful death speakers also kept written records of their techniques and spiritual contacts, often inscribed on materials that could withstand the supernatural energies associated with communication with the dead. If this box contains a complete death speaker's kit, Dr. Reeves explained during one of their planning sessions, it represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in the field of Celtic supernatural practices, but it also potentially contains enough concentrated spiritual energy to cause serious harm if mishandled. Father O'Brien's preliminary spiritual assessment confirmed that the box was indeed a focus for supernatural activity, though he stressed that the presences associated with it did not feel malevolent in the Bayan traditional sense. Whatever is in there seems to be waiting rather than actively trying to cause harm, he observed. It's as if the contents are dormant, but ready to activate under the right circumstances. After weeks of external analysis, the team decided that they needed to examine the box's contents directly, but with extensive precautions in place. They scheduled the opening for the winter solstice, a date that Dr. Reeves believed would minimize the risk of uncontrolled supernatural activation. The laboratory was prepared with protective symbols from multiple religious traditions, and Father O'Brien performed blessing rituals designed to contain any spiritual entities that might be released. Helena carefully lifted the box's lid using tools that would prevent direct contact with her skin, while her colleagues monitored various detection equipment for signs of supernatural activity. As the lid opened, a wave of cold air rushed out of the box, carrying with it the scent of Highland heather and something else that reminded Helena uncomfortably of old graves. Inside the box were exactly the items that Dr. Reeves had predicted. Carved bone tools that had been worn smooth by centuries of use, several dark stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, dried herbs that had somehow retained their potency despite their obvious age, and a collection of small personal items that included children's teeth, locks of hair, and tiny fragments of clothing. But the most significant discovery was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwritten text in what appeared to be a mixture of English and ancient Gaelic. The journal contained detailed instructions for various deaf speaker rituals, along with diagrams and symbols that matched some of the designs Helena had seen in Augustus Morrison's photography studio. More importantly, it contained a section titled The Great Undoing, which appeared to be a master ritual designed to release all souls that had been bound to the physical world through death speaker techniques. Dr. Reeves worked for days to translate the ancient Gaelic text, revealing that the Great Undoing was a complex ceremony that required specific timing, locations, and ritual components. According to the journal, the ritual had been developed by early death speakers as a safeguard against exactly the kind of supernatural crisis that had occurred in Glenmorvich, providing a way to simultaneously release all trapped spirits and neutralize the tools and techniques that had bound them. "This is remarkable," Dr. Reeves told Helena as they reviewed her translation of the ritual instructions. The death speakers apparently understood that their techniques could be misused, and they developed this master ceremony as a way to correct the damage if their power fell into the wrong hands or was used irresponsibly. Helena realized that the Great Undoing might be the key to ensuring that Augustus Morrison's techniques could never be used again to trap innocent souls. While she had successfully released the 18 children connected to Morrison's dolls, the knowledge and tools he had used still existed, potentially waiting for another practitioner to discover and misuse them. But performing the Great Undoing would be an enormous undertaking that would require the team to travel to specific locations connected to Morrison's work and to gather additional ritual components that might be extremely difficult to obtain. The journal indicated that the ceremony needed to be performed at the site where the death speaker had first learned their techniques, which meant that Helena and her colleagues would need to travel to Glenmorvich in the Scottish Highlands. The village of Glenmorvich proved to be even more remote and isolated than Helena had expected when the team arrived there in early March 2026. The highland landscape was still covered in snow, and the narrow roads that led to the village were barely passable even with four-wheel drive vehicles. The village itself consisted of perhaps 50 stone cottages clustered around an ancient church, with a population that couldn't have exceeded 100 people. The locals were initially suspicious of the researchers, clearly uncomfortable with outsiders asking questions about their village's history. But when Helena explained that they were trying to undo damage caused by a former resident's misuse of traditional practices, several of the older villagers began to share stories that had been passed down through their families' grass for generations. "Aye, we remember the Mac Reynolds family," said Hamish MacLeod, a weathered man in his 70s who served as the village's unofficial historian. "My great-grandfather used to tell stories about the troubles they caused, back when the dead wouldn't stay buried. The village hasn't allowed death speakers to practice here since then, and we've been careful to make sure no one else tries to bring back those old ways." Hamish led the team to the ruins of the Mac Reynolds cottage, which had been abandoned since the family's violent departure in 1879. The stone foundation was still visible beneath decades of highland vegetation, and Dr. Chen's electromagnetic equipment immediately detected strong energy readings at the site, according to the ritual instructions in Angus Mac Reynolds's journal. This location would serve as the focal point for the Great Undoing ceremony. The ritual itself required 3 nights of preparation, during which the team needed to purify the site and gather specific natural materials from the surrounding highland landscape. Dr. Reeves had spent months studying the journal's instructions, but she admitted that performing a complex Celtic ritual in a language she had only recently learned presented significant challenges. The ancient Gaelic text is very specific about pronunciation and timing, she explained as they prepared for the first night's preliminary rituals. "If we make mistakes in the incantations or perform the steps out of sequence, we could end up strengthening the supernatural bindings rather than dissolving them." Father O'Brien had coordinated with local religious authorities to ensure that Christian blessing rituals could be incorporated into the Celtic ceremony without creating conflicts between different spiritual traditions. The combination of ancient pagan practices and modern religious protections created a complex multi-layered approach that the team hoped would provide maximum safety while ensuring the ritual's effectiveness. Helena found herself thinking about Marian Fletcher and the other children who had been freed from Augustus Morrison's supernatural imprisonment as the team began their work. She hoped that what they were doing would prevent other innocent souls from suffering similar fates, but she also worried about the risks they were taking by working with such powerful and poorly understood supernatural forces. The first 2 nights of preparation passed without major incident, though all team members reported vivid dreams featuring children calling for help and shadowy figures moving through Highland mist. Dr. Chen's equipment recorded increasing levels of electromagnetic activity as the ritual progressed, and Father O'Brien noted that the spiritual atmosphere at the site was growing more intense with each passing hour. The final night of the Great Undoing ceremony was scheduled for March 20th, the spring equinox, when, according to Celtic tradition, the boundaries between the living and dead were most permeable. As darkness fell over Glenmorvich, Helena and her colleagues gathered at the ruins of the Mac Reynolds cottage, surrounded by candles, ritual implements, and the strange tools they had discovered in Angus Mac Reynolds's wooden box. Dr. Reeves began the ceremony by reading aloud from the ancient journal, her voice carrying across the Highland landscape as she pronounced the complex Gaelic phrases that had been written more than 2 centuries earlier. As she spoke, the electromagnetic readings on Dr. Chen's equipment began to spike dramatically, and the temperature around the cottage ruins dropped by nearly 20 degrees. The ritual required each team member to contribute specific elements at precisely timed intervals. Helena found herself placing children's teeth from Morrison's collection into a small fire that had been built at the center of the cottage foundation, while Dr. Morrison scattered herbs and Father O'Brien recited bull protective prayers in Latin. The combination of different languages and spiritual traditions created a strange but powerful harmony that seemed to resonate with the ancient stones beneath their feet. As the ceremony reached its climax, the Highland landscape around them began to fill with whispered voices and half-glimpsed figures moving through the mist. Helena recognized some of the voices as belonging to the children she had helped release from Morrison's dolls, and she realized that their spirits had returned to witness the final destruction of the techniques that had once imprisoned them. The Great Undoing reached its conclusion as Dr. Reeves spoke the final Gaelic incantation and cast the remaining contents of Angus Mac Reynolds's wooden box into the ritual fire. As the ancient tools and materials burned, the Highland night erupted with supernatural activity that was both beautiful and terrifying. Hundreds of spirit voices joined together in what sounded like a chorus of thanksgiving, while aurora-like lights danced across the sky despite the clear weather conditions. When the fire finally died down and the supernatural activity subsided, Helena felt a profound sense of completion and peace that told her the ritual had been successful. The knowledge and techniques that had allowed both Angus Mac Reynolds and Augustus Morrison to trap souls in the physical world had been permanently neutralized, ensuring that no future practitioner could use them to cause similar harm. The team returned to the United States with a sense of accomplishment and closure, knowing that their work had helped to resolve a supernatural crisis that had persisted for over a century. Helena's final report on the Morrison case documented not only the rescue of 18 trapped child spirits, but also the successful elimination of the death speaker techniques that had created the problem in the first place. In the months that followed, Helena noticed a significant decrease in reports of supernatural activity related to Victorian-era artifacts and photographs. Museums and collectors around the world began to report that previously troublesome objects had become dormant, suggesting that the Great Undoing ceremony had had effects far beyond what the team had originally anticipated. The case of Marian Fletcher and Augustus Morrison's cursed dolls became a legendary example of how historical research, international cooperation, and respect for ancient traditions could combine to solve even the most complex supernatural mysteries. Helena's work was recognized by paranormal research organizations worldwide, and her techniques for investigating and resolving supernatural artifacts became standard practice for museums dealing with potentially haunted objects. But for Helena personally, the most important outcome of the investigation was the knowledge that Marian Fletcher and her fellow child victims were finally at peace. The little girl who had waited over a century for someone to hear her plea for help had found not only her own freedom, but had helped to ensure that no other children would suffer the same supernatural imprisonment that Augustus Morrison's twisted grief had inflicted upon them.